But
Well,
you'll be the main one.
that sounds good. We haven't really been. Let me pause recording for just
some help them achieve some outcomes. And so what I think you really see there is you think through these core principles of Agile is, that, you don't have it's not on this slide, but on the previous one, you talked about trust and accountability. And I really think that, that's what comes out of it is, does management have trust to empower product managers to make decisions at their level, to be able to go and define what is the right scope right now based upon the best information that we have, and it takes away a lot of that agile capabilities that we've been talking about.
Right, and for product managers to engage teams and product managers and teams together to really move forward at internet pace. So why we're Agile-ish? What gets in the way of actually being Agile? So first of all, misunderstanding. So there's the misunderstanding of, oh well, stand up. That's just about asking 3 questions every day, and that sort of seems like a status meeting, and so we can do that in Slack. And no, actually, daily stand-ups or daily scrums are really about replanning every day in a very short amount of time. If software development is a team sport, and that's my number one rule of thumb about software development, is that software development is a team sport. If software development is a team sport, maybe we ought to actually talk to each other once a day. Lack of role models. So we're still, I think we hit critical mass in Agile maybe around 2015. We really didn't have critical mass before that, and it was really sort of on an upswing. Now everyone says they're doing Agile. The question is how many of us are being Agile, and that's the question we're examining here. But up until that point, there really weren't very many role models, and I think it's still a challenge to find what is. It's one of the reasons we wrote that chapter in our book for managers of software development teams is, what's my role now that teams are in charge, I'm not in charge. So that lack of role models around psychological safety and building trust and respect on teams is huge. History. So we've got a history of hundreds of years of the Industrial Revolution in which managers told people what to do, in which that control thing Tom was talking about was at the fore. And we're suddenly, so since the 90s actually, which is when all of these Agile processes began coming along, but only since the 90s, that's a relatively short period of time relative to since the Industrial Revolution and control and micromanagement and command and control. Culture, and and this is part of what Tom was addressing a minute ago, was we need to change the culture of our organizations in order to help us be Agile. It's one of the reasons I started training teams in Agile 12 or 13 years ago, and I found them begging me actually would you talk to our executives about this stuff we're doing, because they don't get it and they get in the way. And so that's fundamentally the executive training I do, is to try to bring them into what is this stuff that your teams are doing? What are you going to get out of it, provided that you support it in a way that brings us into this new culture, and then mindset, which is really the essence, the sort of internal ownership of culture by each one of us.
Yeah, I think back again, to that history, and I want to bring that back to the budgeting point. Is I did some reading here recently, and one of the things that I saw is, when budgeting was first, presented as a tool for control, and it was back with the original McKinsey that founded the McKinsey Consulting Company, who really talked about how important budgeting was. And here we are, 100 years later, and we're still using that same mindset, from a, budgeting perspective. And you're only just starting to see some organizations start to explore other funding models or ways to fund, product development initiatives without going through that same funding model process.
Great. So symptoms of being agile-ish instead of being agile. So stand-ups are really just status meetings. So I talked about those a minute ago. We want stand-ups to be replanning meetings, to be the team. Software development is a team sport. Let's come together as a team to see how we're doing for our sprint plan or for our iteration or for that next bunch of work that we're working on. No team-generated definition of done. So I also co-authored the study of product team performance. So we've done 7 studies of product team performance over the course of the last decade, and we asked people on teams, and some of you may have been part of one of our surveys or one or more of our surveys. We asked people on product teams all over the world to characterize their teams. Is it a high-performance team or a low-performance team or something in between? And then we ask about practices. And it occurred to me about 5 years ago that maybe the definition of done, a team-generated definition of done, might be one of the most important, most powerful, most impactful practices in Agile. And I thought, let's find out. And so we asked that question in the study of product team performance. And what we found was that those teams that had no definition of done whatsoever correlated with the lowest performance teams. Mm-hmm. Just having a definition of done did not correlate with being a high performance team. It was who wrote it. And it was when the team itself wrote their definition of done, or the team was engaged in the writing of the definition of done. So there might be a corporate one, but the team then looked at it and said, what else do we need? What do we need for our part of this product, our part of this project, our part of this work, our customer deliverables, in order to know that we're done with every single story. So this is not acceptance criteria per story. This is the definition of done for every story. When teams write them, that's what correlated with the highest performance teams.
Ron, I remember when you told me, you talked about how that definition of done was so important, and I hadn't really experienced it enough to appreciate it. But since then, I've heard exactly the same information that you've talked about, expressed by others, that, the big reason that a lot of Agile initiatives fail is because of that definition, lacking that definition of done, and just how important that is for, at least from a software development perspective.
Yeah, if you, and for anyone who's watching, anyone who wants to follow up on the various different things we found in the study of product team performance, just go to my website, ronlichty.com. And there's a page for the study and a bunch of the stuff we found. Because one of the other things we found was that we asked the question, how much backlog do you have, and how much have you estimated? And we found that those teams that had a sprint's worth of backlog or less, so occasionally I run into a team that doesn't even have a sprint's worth of backlog when they go into their sprint planning. But the teams that have less than a quarter's worth of backlog correlate with the lowest performance teams. Those teams that have a quarter or more of backlog that is ordered, that is effectively ordered, and that they have estimated, correlate with the highest performance teams.
What do you think the driver on that is, Ron?
Yeah, I think what that says is that we at product management have a roadmap, and that roadmap we've been able to blow those out into stories. We've been able to break it down into stories, and our whole team has got understanding of what those stories is, because the team's gone in and done relative estimating on that whole thing. They can do relative estimating in under half a day on a whole 3 to 6 months worth of work. And that gives them a sense of where product management is going with this thing. And it brings that exercise of sizing at under half a day can be a really useful chartering exercise, because it brings the whole team into product management's thinking around where this thing's going to go.
Yeah, if you go back and look at the Agile principles that we showed, and you don't have to move back to that slide, but when you think about things like communications and collaboration, I think that is the key point. And I know we teach this in our product management class, that, the better your product development team understands how this product is being used, and they understand the context and the scope of it, the better that they're going to go and develop the right product. And I think you're just reflecting that having that backlog already groomed and ready and estimated really is a big part of helping create that shared understanding.
Yep. So another symptom of being Agile-ish is stories being assigned to sprints, stories being assigned to developers. The whole notion in Scrum of sprint planning is of the team figuring out what the most effective sprint plan they can create is, and having a conversation with product management around what the most effective deliverables are for that sprint, and coming together around what's the best sprint plan that we together can come up with. Again, going back to what you were just saying, Tom, about communication and collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Stories that are too big, stories that are really epics in development, and they're pulled over into the next sprint, and sometimes into the one after that, and sometimes into the one after that. No project funding unless every story is detailed and signed off, and that goes directly to what you were talking about a minute ago, Tom, about the budgeting process. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, changes cycling through executive sign-offs. And I wanted to bring those two in together. So go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, exactly. I know that in companies that I've done some consulting and training with, we talk about, especially for software products, I used to have to write a big requirements document that described all the requirements before we could actually move ahead into the project. And, history will show, and I think you have said this too, that only about 50% of those requirements actually get implemented. And so if you think about product management efficiency, that's a waste. And so we talk about, keep things fairly high level until you start getting closer and closer to actually implementing. And then you can do that, backlog refinement process. But yet, I hear organizations say, nope, unless we have these fully detailed into a requirements document, we can't get that funding. And it just goes back, I think, to that, control perspective that we need to figure out how do we overcome that in organizations.
Yeah, when I query developers, and I've queried hundreds of developers on this question over the years, Tom, 50% is actually high. 50% of the range I get from developers of what percentage of requirements that we actually deliver is somewhere between 15 and 45%.
Okay.
Outside of NASA engineers and medical instruments developers. Mm-hmm. Turns out when we send people into outer space, we want to get them back. So another symptom of Agile-ish, teams are not trying a new experiment every sprint. The goal of a retrospective, the goal of having a retrospective, so there are teams that are not holding retrospectives every sprint, holding a retrospective every sprint, coming up with an experiment to try that's going to make us happier, that's going to make us more productive, that's going to make our team, our product of higher quality, that's going to help us and help solve the biggest challenge that we had in the last sprint. One experiment, not a change, but an experiment. The lack of respect and trust is rampant, and it is the essence of psychological safety. And as Google found when it did its study, psychological safety is at the fore of high performance teams. Mm-hmm. And the command and control executive style, which there's not a lot of intersection between Agile and command and control executive style.
Yeah. I think I mentioned to you previously when we talked about 2 months ago, I was listening to an audiobook and they were talking about strategy, but they used a lot of, military analogies around it. And one of the things they talked about is how, if you think about a battle, you can go in with a strategy, but you have to, push some of that decision-making down to the local commander level. And you can
actually the local individual level.
Yeah, or even the local individual, in terms of how they actually execute on that strategy. But if you go in and you detail exactly everything they need to do, and then, you get into combat, it's not going to go that way. And what do? Well, they sit and wait until they get the next command to do. And the history will show those are the ones who lost the battle, where those who had a general guidelines, the strategy, but they had the flexibility of execution, we're much more successful. And I think we still see this in the corporate world where, we want to go in detail exactly how things are going to get executed and not give the person closest to the decision the power and authority, to make that decision.
Yeah,
and,
I'm just reading Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, and he gets into exactly that. I think it's worth reading for understanding the importance of Agile, even in the military context, maybe perhaps most, and bringing that back into our corporate world.
Yeah. And one other thing along that is, and I think this was either Jeff Sutherland or JJ Sutherland in one of their books, talked about how, when they looked at successful teams, the ones who could make a decision the fastest, tended to be more successful. And, when you're in that command and control, you get to a roadblock or you get to a point a decision has to make. It can take days or weeks or months, to get that pushed up and come down to you finally decide how you're going to move ahead. And that kills success right there. All
right. So which of these symptoms of Agilists do you see in your organization? So we're going to bring up a poll. Tim, if you can bring up that second poll now.
Yeah, and this should be a multiple select. So you should be able to select multiple of those and state which one of these. And we've talked about all of those there in our previous slides. So read through those and select which ones you think, you experience.
And Tim, when you think we've got critical mass, bring up results for us.
Yep.
Well, so far we're at 21%. So I'd love to see that.
Yeah, let's
50, 100 would be even better.
Yeah, let's wait just another 15 or 20 seconds and give more people a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of check marks there that you can add, and you've got to evaluate all these things. So we were hoping you were evaluating these as we were talking through them. Oh, my organization's got that, or my organization doesn't.
Yeah, this is perfect. So so here's your 5-minute warning. We're at 65%. So I'm going to end the poll.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. Thank you, Tim. Okay. Let's see. Teams aren't experimenting. Stand-ups are really just status meeting, and no team-generated definition of done are those that sit there at the top. And I'm really surprised to see no project funding as one of those. So that tells me that hopefully your companies are doing some things right in terms of funding models.
All right, so let's move on and talk about how to become truly agile. And so we've only got about 4 minutes to do that in, Tom. So we're going to have to move this one along. So doing products, not projects. So having stable teams that you bring work to, as opposed to assembling random whoever's available now teams for projects. That whole product thinking versus project thinking is huge.
Yeah, I had a client where that they were doing that, where they were just moving development teams around to whatever project was available at the moment. And they finally went to exactly what you talked about, creating stable teams, and it changed their productivity a lot.
Being outcomes driven and not output driven. So the goal isn't to measure the team's velocity. The goal isn't to measure the number of tasks that teams are kicking off. The goal is looking at what kind of impact are we making on our customers.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing. There's a book out there called Outcomes Over Output, and highly recommend it. But it really talks about how so much of what we tend to do is project driven, scope driven, where in reality, what we as product managers need to be thinking about, what difference are we going to make for our customers? And so be thinking about the product outcomes and the business outcomes we're trying to impact. And then hopefully we have flexibility within that to select the right output that is going to best help us achieve those outcomes.
And focus our metrics on outcomes metrics, not output metrics. Mm-hmm. And as I wrote in my most recent blog post, don't ever, ever, ever let velocity be used as a measure of productivity or performance. So outcomes driven, not process driven. So it's not about doing those practices. Those practices, as I threw up on a slide earlier, those practices can be very helpful. But the goal here is effectiveness. The goal is to be effective. Agile practices just give us insight into how to be effective. Mm-hmm. Respect and trust and psychological safety. And as Tom and I noted earlier, Google did a study 5 years ago that they looked into what characterizes their highest performance teams. And the one thing that characterized it more than anything else was psychological safety. And they said you can observe it. You can observe psychological safety because in teams with psychological safety, there is equality in conversational turn taking. Everyone speaks about the same amount of time. There's no one who's dominant. There's no one who's silent. Collaboration with customers, actually bringing customers and getting feedback from customers and regularly showing customers the team's work and getting feedback on whether we're on track or not. And using the Agile Manifesto as a window into the question of, are our practices actually delivering, are our practices actually making us Agile? Are we actually being Agile, or are we just doing, are we just process driven and doing Agile practices?
Well, Ron, I think, we talked through all this. Let's go to the next couple of slides. And I just want to, we have like 1 minute left here, and I want to throw it out for a Q&A session. And then go ahead and put up the sponsor slide too, so we wrap up with that. But any questions from, did Ron and I do an amazing job, and you don't have any questions, or are there any questions or thoughts that anyone wants to share from the discussion that we've had?
Hey, this is Tim, the moderator. You did an awesome job, Tom and Ron. I did have a question about team experiments. Could you give an example or give another example of a team experiment?
Yeah, so let me give an example of, there was so I was working with a team that over the course of its retrospective, they looked at what's the thing that's causing us the most pain, and what they came up with, they realized was that the team was basically, and it was developers and QA, and for some reason, they were finishing everything at the same time, and it was a 2-week sprint on calendar weeks, and they were turning everything over to, they had committed to turn everything over to QA on noon on Wednesday of the second week, and it turned out that most of the time it was Thursday night. And you can imagine that QA, as is too often the case in any kind of process, QA wasn't getting enough time to actually do testing, and stories were either gapping over, or they were doing a bad job of testing. And so what they came up with as an experiment was, let's try having testers and developers working together earlier in designing both test plans and experiments. And they actually came up with a second experiment of, let's see if there's a tool that can provide more automation that allows us to do more of the regression testing in a more automated fashion, so that we can get focused in on just the changes. Both of those were experiments that they moved forward into the next plan. I'm going to say one other thing, which is that in training, I get a ton of questions, and this is far from a universal answer, but it's really common to be able to say, your team should retrospect on that. You're asking me, is there a general rule? There's not a general rule. The rule is what works for your team, and you should talk about that in a retrospective. You're telling me that you've got a problem. Tell each other you've got a problem. Do some brainstorming on what you might do to solve that. Create an experiment. You don't have to create a change. Create an experiment. If my goal is to lose weight, I might create an experiment to get on the treadmill. And I happen to know that I hate the treadmill. Some of you may like it, but I hate it. That's an experiment. I'm not committing to get on the treadmill forever.
Yeah, Tom and Ron, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. We did get a question from Genevieve in the, hopefully I pronounced your name correctly, in the Zoom chat. If you could take a look at that, or continue the conversation on PCA community Slack. We are the orange channel, but Tom and Ron and Tom, thank you so much. This was excellent. So really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you so much. And Genevieve, I'm going to post a link, and it may not come out yet right away, but we just worked on a blog post that we talk about some of these potential funding models that people are doing. So
great, and thank you to Tim for
thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone.
This easy from our standpoint.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Right.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.